The small town of Millbrook had never produced a musical genius before. It was a quiet place where people worked in factories and farms, where dreams were kept small and expectations were kept lower. But in the winter of 1982, a boy named Thomas Red was born with something different inside him. His mother noticed it first. When she played the old radio in their kitchen, the baby would stop crying. His tiny fingers would move in the air as if conducting invisible music. She thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her tired mind. Thomas grew up in a house that had more love than money. His father worked double shifts at the local steel plant. His mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the other side of town. They could barely afford groceries, but they noticed something extraordinary about their son. By the age of 3, Thomas could hum entire symphonies after hearing them just once. He would tap complex rhythms on the kitchen table that made his parents look at each other with wonder and confusion. The Reeds did not own a piano. They did not own any musical instrument at all. But fate has strange ways of finding talent. When Thomas was 5 years old, his mother took him along to one of the houses she cleaned. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, an elderly widow who had once been a music teacher. Her living room held a beautiful grand piano as she no longer played because arthritis had frozen her fingers. Thomas walked into that room and stopped breathing. He had seen pianos in pictures and on television, but never in real life. The instrument seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Without asking permission, without knowing any better, the little boy walked to the bench and sat down. His mother tried to pull him away, apologizing frantically to Mrs. Crawford, but the old woman raised her hand and said to wait. Thomas placed his small fingers on the keys. He pressed one note, then another. A chill ran down Mrs. Crawford's spine. The boy was not making random sounds. He was playing something that sounded like it came from another world. His fingers moved across the keys, as if they remembered something his mind had never learned. The melody was simple but hauntingly beautiful. Mrs. Crawford had taught piano for 40 years. She had seen talented children before, but she had never witnessed anything like this. The boy was a natural in a way that seemed almost impossible. His fingers knew where to go before his brain could tell them. She asked his mother to bring him back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 7 years. Thomas practiced on Mrs. Crawford's piano while his mother cleaned the house. The old woman taught him everything she knew. She gave him music theory books to read. She played recordings of the great masters for him to study. The boy absorbed it all like a sponge drinking water. By age 8, he could play Chopin. By age 10, he was tackling Liszt. By age 12, he was composing his own pieces that made Mrs. Crawford weep. The town of Millbrook slowly became aware that something special was growing in their midst. Word spread about the cleaning lady's son who could make a piano sing. People started coming to Mrs. Crawford's house just to listen through the windows. The local newspaper wrote a small article about him. A television station from the city drove down to film him playing. Thomas did not care about the attention. He cared only about the music. When he sat at the piano, the rest of the world disappeared. His family's poverty faded away. The bullies at school who made fun of his second-hand clothes did not exist. There was only the piano and the music that flowed through him like a river. Mrs. Crawford used her connections to get Thomas into a prestigious summer music program when he turned 13. She paid for it herself, though she could barely afford it on her small pension. The program was designed for wealthy children from musical families. Thomas arrived with a worn suitcase and clothes that did not quite fit. The other students looked at him with suspicion and mockery. But when the evaluation concerts began, everything changed. Thomas sat at the grand piano in the recital hall. His fingers touched the keys, and the room fell completely silent. He played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with such passion and precision that the instructors stood up from their seats. Several of them had tears streaming down their faces when he finished. The head of the program called Mrs. Crawford that night. He said he had never heard anything like it in 30 years of teaching. He said Thomas was not just talented. He was touched by something beyond human understanding. He offered a full scholarship to their year-round academy. Thomas's life was about to change forever. His parents drove him to the academy in their old pickup truck that broke down twice on the way. They helped him carry his few belongings to the dormitory. His mother cried when she hugged him goodbye. His father told him to make them proud. Thomas promised he would. The academy was a different world. The halls were filled with young musicians who had been playing since they could walk. They came from wealthy families with grand pianos in their homes. They had private tutors and expensive instruments. Thomas had none of these advantages. But he had something they did not. He had hunger. He had passion that burned like fire in his chest. Thomas practiced more than anyone else at the academy. He woke up before dawn to get extra time in the practice rooms. He stayed up late studying scores by candlelight when the lights went out. His teachers marveled at his dedication. His fellow students grew from suspicious to respectful to inspired by his example. By age 16, Thomas was winning international competitions. Critics called him a prodigy. They compared him to the legends of piano history. Agents and managers started calling with offers. Record labels wanted to sign him. Concert halls wanted to book him. The boy from the small town with nothing was becoming one of the most promising pianists in the world. Thomas never forgot where he came from. He sent money home to his parents every month. He visited Mrs. Crawford whenever he could. He practiced even harder because he knew how lucky he was to have this gift. He knew that talent alone was not enough. Hard work and dedication were what would carry him to greatness. The summer before his 18th birthday, Thomas was preparing for the most important concert of his young life. He had been invited to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City. It was the dream of every classical pianist. The concert would be broadcast around the world. Critics and musicians from every country would be watching. His entire future depended on this single performance. Thomas practiced 16 hours a day for 3 months. He memorized every note of the 3 pieces he would play. He worked on his interpretation until every phrase was perfect. He did physical exercises to strengthen his hands and fingers. He meditated to calm his mind. He was ready for his moment of destiny. But fate had other plans. 2 weeks before the concert, something terrible happened that would change everything. Thomas was helping his father fix the roof of their old family home during a brief visit. It was supposed to be a simple job. Instead, it became the end of one dream and the beginning of another. The morning started like any other summer day in Millbrook. The sun rose over the hills and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds sang in the old oak tree outside the Reed family home. Thomas woke up early as always, his mind already running through the pieces he would play at Carnegie Hall. He had agreed to help his father with a small repair job before returning to the academy. The roof had been leaking for years. Water stains marked the ceiling of his parents' bedroom, like maps of unknown countries. His father had finally saved enough money to buy new shingles. Thomas wanted to help because he felt guilty about how little time he spent at home. His career had taken him far away from the people who raised him. They climbed onto the roof together, father and son. The old shingles were slippery from morning dew. His father explained what needed to be done. They would tear off the damaged sections and replace them with new material. It was simple work, the kind that people in small towns did all the time without thinking about danger. Thomas was carrying a bundle of new shingles when his foot slipped. He reached out to grab something, anything to stop his fall. His right hand found the edge of a metal gutter. The sharp edge sliced through his flesh like a hot knife through butter. He heard himself scream before he felt the pain. His father caught him before he could tumble off the roof. Blood was everywhere, bright red against the gray shingles. Thomas looked at his hand, and his world collapsed. His little finger was hanging by a thin strip of skin. The bone was visible through the torn flesh. His father wrapped the hand in his shirt and rushed him to the hospital. The next hours were a blur of pain and terror. Doctors and nurses surrounded him in the emergency room. They spoke in hushed voices that Thomas could not understand through the fog of shock. His mother arrived with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Crawford came too, her old hands shaking as she held his mother. The surgeon was a kind man with tired eyes. He explained the situation in gentle words that still felt like hammers. The finger could not be saved. The damage was too severe. They would have to amputate it to prevent infection from spreading. Thomas begged them to try anything else. He explained about Carnegie Hall. He explained that he needed all 10 fingers to play. The surgeon shook his head sadly. He said he was sorry. He said there was no other option. The surgery happened that night. When Thomas woke up the next morning, his right hand had only 4 fingers. A white bandage covered the place where his little finger used to be. His career as a pianist was over before it had truly begun. The days that followed were the darkest of Thomas's life. He lay in his childhood bedroom and stared at the ceiling. He refused to eat. He refused to talk. He refused to see anyone except his mother. The hand throbbed with pain that no medicine could fully stop. But the pain in his heart was worse. Letters and calls came from everywhere. The academy sent condolences. His teachers wrote that they were devastated. The Carnegie Hall concert was canceled. Newspapers ran stories about the tragic accident that had destroyed a rising star. Music critics wrote about what could have been. Everyone spoke of Thomas Reed in the past tense, as if he had died. Mrs. Crawford came to visit 1 week after the surgery. She sat beside his bed and held his left hand in both of hers. She did not offer false hope or empty words. She simply sat with him in his grief. After a long silence, she finally spoke. She told him a story he had never heard before. When she was young, she had dreamed of being a concert pianist too. She had talent and passion, and all the support anyone could want. But arthritis had started in her fingers when she was only 35. It had slowly stolen her ability to play. She understood what he was feeling because she had felt it herself. Thomas looked at her with empty eyes. He asked, what was the point of her story? Was she trying to tell him that life goes on? That he would find something else to live for? He did not want something else. He wanted the piano. He wanted the music that was still screaming inside his head with no way to get out. Mrs. Crawford shook her head. She was not trying to give him false comfort. She was trying to tell him something important. When she lost her ability to play, she thought her connection to music was finished. But she discovered that music was bigger than just playing an instrument. She became a teacher instead. She found new ways to stay connected to the thing she loved. Thomas asked bitterly if she was suggesting he become a teacher. He was only 17 years old. He had never wanted anything except to perform. Teaching was what people did when their dreams died. He did not want to accept that his dreams were dead. Mrs. Crawford squeezed his hand tighter. She told him that was not what she meant at all. She meant that he should not give up yet. She had seen impossible things in her years of teaching. She had seen students overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. She had seen talent find new ways to express itself. She asked him a question that would change his life. Had he actually tried to play the piano since the accident? Thomas stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Play the piano? With 9 fingers? It was impossible. Every piece he knew required all 10 fingers. The techniques he had mastered for 18 years were useless now. Mrs. Crawford smiled her gentle smile. She reminded him that there was once a time when he had never touched a piano at all. There was a time when he knew nothing about music except the songs in his head. He had started from nothing and become extraordinary. Why did he assume he could not start again? Thomas told her she was being ridiculous. He was not a beginner anymore. He knew exactly what piano playing required. He knew the physical demands of the repertoire he loved. Losing a finger was not like learning a new piece. It was like having his soul cut in half. Mrs. Crawford stood up slowly with her old bones creaking. She walked to the door and turned back to face him. She said one more thing before she left. She said that the greatest musicians in history had all faced moments when everything seemed lost. The ones who became legends were the ones who refused to quit. She told him to think about what kind of musician he wanted to be. The old woman left, and Thomas was alone again with his grief. But something she said had planted a tiny seed in his mind. He tried to ignore it. He tried to drown it in self-pity and despair. But the seed would not die. 3 days later, Thomas got out of bed for the first time since the surgery. His legs were weak and his head was dizzy. He walked slowly down the stairs to the living room where his mother sat reading. She looked up at him with hope and fear mixed in her eyes. Thomas asked if she could drive him to Mrs. Crawford's house. His mother started crying and nodding at the same time. She grabbed her keys and helped him to the car. They drove in silence through the familiar streets of Millbrook. Mrs. Crawford was waiting for them at the door. It was as if she knew he would come. She led Thomas to her living room, where the grand piano sat in the same spot it had always been. The instrument seemed to mock him with its 88 keys that now felt like enemies instead of friends. Thomas sat down on the bench with his heart pounding. His right hand was still bandaged. His left hand was trembling. He placed both hands on the keys and pressed down. The sound that came out was wrong. His finger positioning was off. His muscle memory was confused by the missing digit. He tried again, and again. Each attempt sounded worse than the one before. Frustration built inside him like a storm. He slammed his hands down on the keys in a crash of dissonant noise. He started to cry for the first time since the accident. Mrs. Crawford sat down beside him on the bench. She did not say anything. She just waited. When his tears finally stopped, she asked him what he wanted to do. Did he want to give up, or did he want to fight? Thomas looked at his bandaged hand. He looked at the piano keys. He thought about everything he had worked for, and everything he had lost. And somewhere deep inside him, a flame that had almost died began to flicker back to life. He told Mrs. Crawford he wanted to fight. He did not know how. He did not know if it was possible. But he was not ready to let his dream die without trying everything. The old woman smiled and patted his shoulder. She said they would figure it out together. The weeks that followed were filled with frustration and failure. Thomas spent every day at Mrs. Crawford's piano, trying to make his 9 fingers do the work of 10. His right hand felt like it belonged to a stranger. The balance was wrong. The reach was different. Everything he had learned over 18 years of practice seemed useless now. He started by trying to play simple scales, the most basic exercises that every pianist learns first. Even these felt impossible. His brain kept sending signals to a finger that no longer existed. His remaining fingers bumped into each other as they tried to compensate. The sounds that came from the piano were clumsy and uneven, nothing like the beautiful music he used to create. Mrs. Crawford watched and listened without offering much advice. She understood that Thomas needed to discover things for himself. She could not teach him how to play with 9 fingers, because no one had ever taught her. This was new territory for both of them. Thomas grew angry at himself and at the world. He threw music books across the room. He cursed at the piano as if it were his enemy. He stormed out of Mrs. Crawford's house some days without saying goodbye. But he always came back. The need to play was stronger than his frustration. One evening, Thomas stayed at the piano until long after midnight. Mrs. Crawford had gone to bed hours earlier. The house was dark, except for a single lamp illuminating the keyboard. Thomas was exhausted, and his hand ached from overuse. He should have stopped and rested. Instead, he kept playing the same passage over and over again. Something strange happened in those quiet hours. His conscious mind was too tired to interfere. His fingers began to move on their own, finding new patterns that his brain had not planned. He played a chord that should have required 5 fingers, but he played it with 4. His thumb stretched slightly wider than normal. His other fingers adjusted their positions automatically. Thomas stopped and stared at his hand. What had just happened? He tried to recreate the movement deliberately. It did not work. His conscious effort blocked whatever had happened naturally. But he knew now that something was possible. His hand had shown him a path, even if his mind could not yet follow it. He shared this discovery with Mrs. Crawford the next morning. Her eyes lit up with interest. She asked him to describe exactly what had happened. Thomas struggled to explain something he barely understood himself. His hand had moved differently than before. It had found a new way to create the same sound. Mrs. Crawford suggested they approach the problem scientifically. They would study how his hand worked now, with 9 fingers instead of 10. They would analyze every movement and find new techniques that fit his new reality. It would be like learning to play all over again, but with the knowledge and experience he had already gained. They started with anatomy. Mrs. Crawford brought books about the human hand and how it functioned. Thomas studied the muscles, tendons, and joints that controlled finger movement. He learned how each finger connected to the hand and how they worked together. Understanding the mechanics helped him see new possibilities. The missing little finger had primarily been used for reaching the highest notes in wide, chords, and for certain technical passages. Thomas realized he needed to compensate in 2 ways. First, he needed to strengthen his remaining fingers to handle the extra work. Second, he needed to develop new techniques for playing passages that traditionally required all 5 fingers. He designed exercises specifically for his situation. He practiced stretching his thumb wider than normal to cover more keys. He worked on strengthening his ring finger, which now had to do more work. He developed new finger combinations for common chord shapes. Each exercise addressed a specific problem he had identified. The progress was painfully slow. Some days felt like steps backward rather than forward. Thomas would master one technique only to discover 3 more problems. His hand cramped from the unusual positions. Blisters formed on fingers that were working harder than they had before. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Thomas noticed that his left hand was becoming stronger than before. It was taking on more responsibility, while his right hand adjusted. He discovered that certain passages actually sounded better when played with slightly different fingerings. The limitations were forcing him to find creative solutions. Mrs. Crawford invited a few trusted colleagues to observe Thomas's progress. They were skeptical at first. No one believed that a pianist could maintain a professional level with 9 fingers. But as they watched Thomas play, their skepticism turned to amazement. One visitor was a music professor from a famous conservatory. He had come expecting to see a tragic story of lost potential. Instead, he witnessed something revolutionary. Thomas was not just adapting to his disability. He was developing new techniques that no one had seen before. The professor asked Thomas to explain what he was doing differently. Thomas demonstrated his new approach to chord voicing. He showed how he used his thumb in ways that traditional technique discouraged. He explained his modified finger crossings that allowed smooth transitions despite the missing digit. The professor took notes furiously. He said these techniques could benefit all pianists, not just those with disabilities. Thomas had accidentally discovered more efficient ways of playing certain passages. His limitation had forced him to find shortcuts that able-bodied pianists had never bothered to seek. Word began to spread through the classical music world. People whispered about the young prodigy who was reinventing piano technique from his mentor's living room. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others were curious enough to investigate. Letters arrived from music schools asking for more information. Thomas paid little attention to the growing interest. He was too focused on his work. He set himself a goal that seemed impossible: to perform at Carnegie Hall as originally planned, not as a charity case or a curiosity, but as a serious musician worthy of the stage on his own merits. 6 months after the accident, Thomas played his first complete piece without stopping to fix mistakes. It was a simple nocturne by Chopin, one of the first pieces Mrs. Crawford had taught him years ago. The music flowed from his fingers like water, finding its way downhill. It was not perfect. There were small imperfections that any trained ear would notice. But it was music, real music, and it was beautiful. Mrs. Crawford wept openly when he finished. She said she had witnessed something extraordinary. She had watched a boy become a man. She had seen determination triumph over despair. She had observed the birth of something new in the world of music. Thomas felt something he had not felt since the accident. He felt hope. Not the false hope of denial, but the real hope that comes from evidence. He could play again. Not the same as before. Perhaps never as technically brilliant as he might have been. But he could play. And playing was all he had ever wanted. The Academy contacted him about returning to finish his studies. Thomas declined their offer. What they taught there no longer applied to him. He was learning something that existed in no textbook and had been discovered by no other teacher. He needed to continue his work with Mrs. Crawford, developing his unique approach further. His parents worried about his decision. They had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities. They did not understand why he would reject a path back to his old life. Thomas tried to explain that his old life was gone forever. He could only build a new one. Thomas spent another year in Millbrook, practicing and developing his technique. He filled notebooks with observations and diagrams. He documented everything he learned so that others could benefit from his discoveries. Mrs. Crawford helped him organize his ideas into a coherent system. By his 19th birthday, Thomas was ready to show the world what he had created. He contacted the agent who had offered to represent him before the accident. The agent was surprised to hear from him. He assumed Thomas had retired from music entirely, but he agreed to meet and see what the young man had accomplished. The meeting took place in Mrs. Crawford's living room. Thomas played for 90 minutes without stopping. He performed pieces that were considered impossible for a pianist with only 9 fingers. His techniques were unconventional. His finger movements looked strange to anyone trained in traditional methods. But the music that emerged was undeniably magnificent. The agent sat in stunned silence when Thomas finished. He had represented many talented musicians in his career. He had heard many extraordinary performances, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. Thomas Reed had not just adapted to his disability. He had transformed it into something unprecedented. The agent asked one question. Was Thomas ready to perform publicly? Thomas smiled for the first time in over a year. He had been ready since the day he lost his finger. He just needed to find a new way to show it. The announcement of Thomas Reed's comeback concert sent shockwaves through the classical music world. Critics and musicians debated endlessly about what to expect. Some predicted disaster. They said a 9-fingered pianist could not possibly perform at a professional level. They worried the concert would be embarrassing for everyone involved. Others approached the news with curiosity and open minds. They had heard rumors about the new techniques Thomas had developed. They wanted to see for themselves whether the stories were true. The concert sold out within hours of tickets becoming available. Thomas chose a small venue for his return. It was a 300-seat concert hall in Boston that hosted young artists and experimental performances. He wanted to prove himself in front of a real audience before attempting anything larger. The pressure was enormous, but he had prepared for this moment for nearly 2 years. The night of the concert arrived on a cold evening in November. Thomas stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the audience through the curtain. His heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst from his chest. His hands were sweating, despite the chill in the air. Doubts crept into his mind like shadows. Mrs. Crawford was there with him, as she had been since the beginning. She held his hands in hers and looked into his eyes. She reminded him that he had already accomplished the impossible. Whatever happened tonight could not change that. He had proven that 9 fingers could make beautiful music. Now he just needed to share that music with the world. Thomas walked onto the stage to modest applause. The audience was polite but skeptical. Many of them had come expecting to witness a curiosity rather than a true artist. They wanted to see the 9-fingered pianist the way people want to see unusual animals at a zoo. He sat at the grand piano and adjusted the bench. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights. Thomas looked at the keyboard and felt a sudden calm wash over him. This was where he belonged. This was what he was born to do. The audience, the critics, the doubters, none of them mattered. Only the music mattered. He began with one of Chopin's nocturnes, the same piece he had played for Mrs. Crawford when he first succeeded after the accident. The opening notes floated into the silent hall like drops of rain on still water. The audience leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear any weakness or flaw. They found nothing to criticize. The music was pure and beautiful, filled with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the pianist's soul. Thomas's hands moved across the keys with grace and precision. His missing finger was invisible to anyone watching. The music spoke for itself. When the nocturne ended, the audience sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then the applause began. It started slowly, scattered claps from different parts of the hall. It grew steadily louder until the small venue echoed with the sound of appreciation. Thomas did not pause to acknowledge the response. He moved directly into his next piece, a challenging etude by Liszt that pushed his new techniques to their limits. This was where the skeptics expected him to fail. Liszt's music demanded everything a pianist could give. It seemed impossible to play with anything less than perfect equipment. The audience watched in amazement as Thomas attacked the piece with fierce intensity. His fingers flew across the keyboard at speeds that seemed impossible. His right hand moved in patterns that looked wrong, but sounded absolutely right. The music swelled and crashed like waves against rocks. Halfway through the etude, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped thinking about his missing finger entirely. They forgot why they had come. They forgot their skepticism and doubt. They simply listened to the music, transported by its power and beauty. When Thomas struck the final chord, the audience erupted. People rose to their feet, shouting and clapping with genuine enthusiasm. This was not polite applause for a brave attempt. This was the response to a great performance by a great artist. Thomas stood and bowed, his eyes glistening with emotion. He looked into the audience and saw Mrs. Crawford in the front row, crying and smiling at the same time. His parents were there too, looking proud and bewildered by what their son had accomplished. The reviews the next day were extraordinary. Critics who had predicted failure admitted they were wrong. They praised Thomas's technical innovation and emotional depth. They compared him to the legendary pianists of the past. Some said he had played better than many artists with all 10 fingers. But not everyone was impressed. Some traditionalists in the classical music establishment rejected Thomas's new approach. They called it a gimmick. They said his techniques violated fundamental principles of piano playing. They predicted that his success would be short-lived once audiences grew tired of the novelty. These criticisms stung, but Thomas refused to let them discourage him. He had faced worse obstacles than harsh words from jealous rivals. He continued to develop his techniques, pushing himself further with each passing month. His agent arranged a series of concerts across the country. Each performance attracted larger audiences than the last. Word spread about the 9-fingered pianist who played like an angel. People wanted to see this miracle for themselves. Thomas discovered that his story resonated with people far beyond the classical music world. He received letters from individuals facing their own challenges and limitations. They wrote about injuries, disabilities, and setbacks that seemed insurmountable. They told him that watching his performance gave them hope. One letter came from a young girl named Sarah, who had lost her arm in a car accident. She had dreamed of becoming a pianist before the accident. Her parents had bought a piano that now sat unused in their living room. Sarah watched a video of Thomas performing and decided to try playing again. Thomas wrote back to Sarah immediately. He shared some of the techniques he had developed and encouraged her to experiment with her own solutions. He told her that limitations were not the end of dreams. They were the beginning of new possibilities. This correspondence sparked an idea in Thomas's mind. He realized that his discoveries could help others facing similar challenges. The techniques he had developed were not just for himself. They could be taught and shared with anyone willing to learn. Thomas began offering workshops for pianists with disabilities. Students came from across the country to learn his methods. Some were missing fingers like him. Others had limited mobility from injuries or medical conditions. All of them shared a love of music that physical limitations could not extinguish. The workshops were transformative for everyone involved. Thomas discovered that teaching deepened his own understanding of the techniques. His students offered new perspectives and insights that improved his methods. Together, they were building something larger than any individual could create alone. Medical professionals began taking notice of Thomas's work. Doctors and therapists who worked with patients recovering from hand injuries contacted him. They wanted to understand how he had rehabilitated himself so effectively. They believed his approach could benefit others in physical rehabilitation. Thomas collaborated with a team of researchers to study his techniques scientifically. They used motion capture technology to analyze his hand movements. They compared his approach to traditional piano technique and documented the differences. The results were published in a medical journal. The study confirmed what Thomas had discovered intuitively. His techniques were not just workarounds for his missing finger. They were more efficient methods of playing that reduced strain on the hands and wrists. Traditional technique had evolved over centuries without questioning certain assumptions. Thomas's limitations had forced him to question everything. This discovery had implications beyond disability accommodation. Professional pianists who suffered from repetitive strain injuries could benefit from his methods. Teachers could use his insights to prevent injuries in their students. The classical music world was slowly beginning to recognize that Thomas had contributed something valuable to their art form. Carnegie Hall contacted Thomas again, 3 years after his accident. They invited him to perform the concert that had been canceled. This time, there was no question about whether he was ready. The only question was whether the audience was ready to witness something they had never seen before. Thomas accepted the invitation without hesitation. He had been waiting for this moment since the day he lost his finger. Everything he had endured, everything he had learned, everything he had overcome had led to this. Carnegie Hall was waiting, and Thomas Reed was finally ready to take the stage. The day of the Carnegie Hall concert and gray and cold in New York City. Snow fell gently on the streets outside the famous venue. Thomas arrived early in the morning to rehearse in the empty hall. The grand piano sat on the stage like an old friend waiting to embrace him. He walked through the silent auditorium and looked at the rows of empty red velvet seats. Tonight, nearly 3,000 people would fill the space to hear him play. Some of them had been waiting since his canceled concert years ago. Others had heard about the nine-fingered pianist and wanted to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Thomas sat at the piano and ran his fingers across the keys without pressing them. He remembered the first time he had touched a piano in Mrs. Crawford's living room. He remembered being a small boy who knew nothing about music except the melodies in his head. That boy could never have imagined this moment. The rehearsal went smoothly. His fingers found their positions with the confidence that came from thousands of hours of practice. The techniques he had developed felt natural now, as comfortable as breathing. He no longer thought about compensating for his missing finger. He simply played. Mrs. Crawford arrived in the afternoon with Thomas's parents. They were staying at a hotel nearby, overwhelmed by the size and grandeur of the city. Thomas took them on a tour of the backstage area. He showed them the dressing rooms where legendary pianists had prepared for their performances. His mother could not stop crying. She kept touching his face and saying she was proud of him. His father stood quietly, his eyes red and his jaw tight with emotion he could not express. These were simple people who never expected their son to achieve such heights. They still did not fully understand the world Thomas now inhabited. Mrs. Crawford seemed completely at ease in the famous hall. She had performed here herself decades ago, before arthritis stole her career. She walked the corridors with memories in her eyes. She told Thomas that bringing him to this stage was the greatest accomplishment of her long life. The hours before the concert passed in a blur of nervous energy. Thomas tried to rest in his dressing room, but could not quiet his racing mind. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The accident on the roof, the dark days of despair, the slow and painful journey of recovery. All of it had been preparation for tonight. As evening approached, Thomas changed into his concert attire. A perfectly fitted black suit and crisp white shirt, polished shoes that clicked on the hardwood floors. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The scared boy from Millbrook had become something else entirely. A knock on the door announced that it was time. Thomas took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. The murmur of the audience grew louder as he approached the wings. He could hear 3,000 voices blending into a single sound of anticipation. The house lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. Thomas stepped onto the stage of Carnegie Hall and was momentarily blinded by the spotlights. The applause was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to push against his chest. He walked to the piano with steady steps and bowed to the audience. He sat at the bench and waited for complete silence. Every eye in the vast hall was fixed on him. Every ear was straining to hear the first note. The moment stretched into eternity. Then Thomas placed his hands on the keys and began to play. He had chosen a challenging program that showcased his unique abilities. The opening piece was a Bach prelude that required precise finger independence. Thomas played it with crystal clarity, each note ringing pure and true in the acoustically perfect hall. The audience barely dared to breathe. They watched his hands move across the keyboard and tried to understand what they were seeing. His right hand had only 4 fingers, yet it produced sounds that seemed impossible. The missing digit was irrelevant. The music was everything. After the Bach came a selection of Chopin mazurkas. These pieces required emotional nuance as much as technical skill. Thomas poured his heart into every phrase. The longing and joy and melancholy of Chopin's music filled the hall like perfume. Intermission arrived too soon. The audience rose to their feet with sustained applause that continued even as Thomas left the stage. In the lobby, people discussed what they had just witnessed. Critics furiously revised the reviews they had planned to write. Everyone agreed they were experiencing something special. The second half of the concert began with Liszt's Transcendental Etudes. These were among the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. Many 10-fingered pianists avoided them because of their extreme technical demands. Thomas had chosen them deliberately to prove that his limitations were not limitations at all. He attacked the etudes with fierce passion. His fingers blazed across the keyboard at speeds that seemed inhuman. The music roared and whispered and screamed and sighed. The audience sat transfixed, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. During a particularly challenging passage, something unexpected happened. Thomas's new techniques allowed him to play a section with a fluidity that traditional fingering could not achieve. The sound was cleaner and more connected than any previous recording of the piece. He had not just compensated for his disability. He had improved upon perfection. The final piece of the evening was Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2. This was the work Thomas had been preparing when the accident occurred years ago. He had chosen it as a symbol of his journey from destruction to triumph. The sonata lasted nearly half an hour. It demanded everything from the performer, physically and emotionally. Thomas gave himself completely to the music, holding nothing back. Sweat ran down his face as he navigated the treacherous technical passages. Tears formed in his eyes during the beautiful second movement. When the final chord rang out and faded into silence, the audience sat motionless. No one moved. No one made a sound. The spell of the music held them frozen in their seats. Then the dam broke. The audience exploded with sound. People leaped to their feet, shouting and clapping and crying. The applause was not just appreciation for a good performance. It was a celebration of the human spirit. It was acknowledgement that they had witnessed something that would be remembered for generations. Thomas stood and bowed again and again. The applause continued without fading. People in the front rows had tears streaming down their faces. Complete strangers embraced each other, united by the experience they had shared. Mrs. Crawford was brought onto the stage to share the moment. Thomas held her hand as the audience cheered for both of them. Without her faith and guidance, none of this would have been possible. She had saved his life as surely as if she had pulled him from drowning water. The newspapers the next morning called it one of the greatest concerts in Carnegie Hall's history. Critics used words like transcendent and revolutionary and miraculous. They wrote that Thomas Reed had not just overcome his disability. He had used it to achieve something that no 10-fingered pianist could match. The concert recording was released months later and won multiple awards. It became one of the best-selling classical albums of the decade. People who knew nothing about classical music bought it because they had heard the story of the 9-fingered pianist. Thomas Reed had become more than a musician. He had become a symbol of hope. Invitations poured in from orchestras and concert halls around the world. Thomas could have spent the rest of his life traveling and performing. But something Mrs. Crawford had told him years ago kept echoing in his mind. She had said that music was bigger than just playing an instrument. Thomas was beginning to understand what she meant. He had a gift to share that went beyond his own performances. The techniques he had developed could change how piano was taught and played. His story could inspire others facing challenges of their own. The question was how to share these gifts with the world. The years following the Carnegie Hall concert transformed Thomas from a performer into a movement. His techniques spread through the classical music world like wildfire. Conservatories that had initially dismissed his methods began incorporating them into their curricula. Teachers who had criticized him now sought his guidance. Thomas established the Reed Foundation for Adaptive Music with funding from his concert earnings and generous donors. The foundation provided scholarships for musicians with disabilities. It funded research into new therapeutic approaches for hand injuries. It created resources for teachers who wanted to learn alternative techniques. The foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse in Boston. Inside, practice rooms were equipped with pianos adapted for various needs. Recording studios documented the progress of students. Researchers analyzed hand movements and developed new exercises. The building hummed with activity from dawn until late at night. Students came from all over the world to study at the foundation. Some had been told they would never play again after accidents or illnesses. Others had been born with conditions that made traditional piano playing impossible. All of them found hope within those walls. Thomas personally worked with the most challenging cases. He spent hours analyzing each student's unique situation. What worked for one person might not work for another. Every disability required its own solution. The process demanded creativity and patience in equal measure. A young man named Marcus arrived at the foundation after losing 3 fingers in a factory accident. He had played piano since childhood, and music was his entire identity. Doctors told him he would never perform again. His family had already donated his piano to a local church. Thomas watched Marcus struggle at the keyboard for weeks. The young man grew frustrated and angry. He cursed himself and the universe for taking away the thing he loved most. Thomas recognized these emotions intimately. He had felt them himself in the dark days after his own accident. Instead of offering empty comfort, Thomas shared his story honestly. He described the despair that had consumed him after losing his finger. He talked about the nights when he wanted to give up completely. He explained how Mrs. Crawford had helped him find a reason to keep fighting. Marcus listened with tears in his eyes. For the first time, he felt truly understood. Someone who had walked his path was offering a hand to guide him forward. The healing began that day, not just in his hands, but in his heart. Thomas developed a customized training program for Marcus. They experimented with different hand positions and finger combinations. They explored techniques that used the palm and wrist to compensate for missing digits. Progress was slow but steady. After 18 months of intensive work, Marcus performed his first public concert. The venue was small, just a community center in his hometown. But the audience of family and friends witnessed something remarkable. Marcus played a complete recital with only 7 fingers, using techniques that Thomas had helped him develop. Stories like this became common at the Reed Foundation. Musicians who had been told their careers were over discovered new ways to create beauty. Some went on to professional performing careers. Others became teachers themselves, spreading the knowledge they had gained. Thomas also continued his own performing career, though he limited his concerts to allow more time for teaching and research. Each performance became an opportunity to demonstrate what was possible. He chose challenging repertoire specifically to prove that his techniques had no limitations. Critics noticed that his playing continued to improve year after year. Most pianists peaked in their 30s or 40s before gradual decline set in. Thomas seemed immune to this pattern. His unique approach to technique reduced the physical strain that wore down other performers. Medical researchers became increasingly interested in his methods. A team from a major university conducted a comprehensive study comparing his approach to traditional piano technique. They measured muscle activation, joint stress, and energy efficiency during performance. The results were striking. Thomas's techniques required less physical effort to produce the same sounds. His methods distributed the workload more evenly across the hand and arm. Movements that traditional technique performed with tension, he performed with relaxation. These findings had implications far beyond disability accommodation. Repetitive strain injuries plagued many professional pianists. Careers were shortened or destroyed by conditions like focal dystonia and tendinitis. Thomas's approach offered potential prevention and treatment for these common problems. A textbook documenting his methods was published to international acclaim. It became required reading at music schools around the world. The book explained the principles behind his techniques and provided exercises for developing them. Translations appeared in dozens of languages. Thomas embarked on a lecture tour to promote the new approach. He visited conservatories and universities, demonstrating his techniques and answering questions. Audiences included students, teachers, and medical professionals, all eager to learn. At one lecture, an elderly professor challenged Thomas directly. He claimed that traditional technique had been refined over centuries by the greatest pianists in history. Who was Thomas to suggest that they had been wrong all along? Thomas responded with characteristic humility. He agreed that traditional technique was effective and had produced countless great performers. He was not claiming it was wrong. He was simply offering an alternative that some people might find useful. Music was not about right and wrong methods. It was about finding ways to express what was inside the soul. The professor was unconvinced, but many in the audience were persuaded. Thomas's willingness to acknowledge the value of traditional approaches while proposing new ones demonstrated intellectual honesty. He was not trying to destroy the past. He was trying to build on it. As his influence grew, Thomas received numerous prestigious honors. Universities awarded him honorary doctorates. Musical organizations presented lifetime achievement awards. Government officials recognized his contributions to accessibility and concrete accessibility and rehabilitation. But the recognition that meant most came from individuals whose lives he had touched. Letters arrived daily from people who had been inspired by his story. Some were musicians. Many were not. They wrote about overcoming challenges of all kinds, from physical disabilities to personal tragedies. One letter came from a soldier who had lost his arm in combat. He had fallen into depression after returning home, convinced his life was worthless. Then he saw a documentary about Thomas and decided to try playing piano for the first time. Learning music with one hand gave him purpose again. Another letter came from a grandmother whose stroke had paralyzed one side of her body. Her granddaughter had played a recording of Thomas's concert for her. Hearing what he accomplished with 9 fingers motivated her to fight harder in rehabilitation. She was now able to walk again. These letters reminded Thomas why his work mattered. The techniques he developed were important, but they were just tools. The real impact was the hope he gave to people who felt hopeless. The belief that limitations could be transformed into strengths. Mrs. Crawford passed away peacefully in her sleep during Thomas's 5th year running the foundation. She was 92 years old and had lived to see her student change the world. Thomas spoke at her funeral, struggling to find words adequate to express what she had meant to him. He told the mourners that Mrs. Crawford had taught him everything important he knew, not just about piano, but about life. She had shown him that love was stronger than despair, that belief in others could help them believe in themselves, that the end of one dream was often the beginning of another. The grand piano from her living room was donated to the Reed Foundation. It sat in the main lobby, the first thing visitors saw when they entered. A small plaque explained its significance. On that piano, a boy with 10 fingers had learned to play. And on that same piano, a man with 9 fingers had learned to play again. 20 years had passed since the accident on the rooftop in Millbrook. Thomas sat at his piano in the Foundation's main concert hall, preparing for a very special performance. Tonight would mark the anniversary of his Carnegie Hall debut, and he had invited his students to join him on stage. The concert hall was filled with over 1,000 guests. Musicians, doctors, educators, and supporters had gathered from around the world. Cameras were set up to broadcast the event to millions more watching online. What had begun as one young man's struggle had become a global movement. Thomas looked at the students assembled on stage with him. There were 17 of them, each with their own story of challenge and triumph. Marcus was there, now a successful recording artist with 7 fingers. Sarah, the girl who had written to him years ago, had become a concert pianist performing with 1 arm. Others had overcome strokes, birth defects, and accidents of every kind. He addressed the audience before the performance began. He spoke about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He remembered the dark days when he believed his life was over. He honored Mrs. Crawford and everyone who had helped him find a new path. He thanked his parents for their sacrifice and unconditional love, but mostly he spoke about the students on stage with him. They were the true heroes of this story, he said. Each of them had faced their own impossible moment. Each had chosen to fight when giving up would have been easier. They had transformed their limitations into gifts that enriched the world. The concert began with Thomas playing alone. He performed the same nocturne by Chopin that he had played for Mrs. Crawford on the day he decided to fight. The music floated through the hall, gentle and pure, carrying memories of all the years that had passed. Then the students joined him one by one. They played duets and ensemble pieces, their varied techniques blending into harmonies that no traditional performance could achieve. The audience watched in wonder as 17 musicians, each with different physical limitations, created beauty together. The finale was a new composition that Thomas had written specifically for this occasion. It required 18 pianists playing multiple pianos simultaneously. The piece incorporated techniques developed at the foundation over 20 years. It was music that could only exist because of what they had all learned together. When the final notes faded, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 15 minutes. Thomas and his students stood together, holding hands, accepting the gratitude and love pouring from the crowd. Tears streamed down faces throughout the hall. After the concert, Thomas slipped away from the reception to visit his parents. They were both in their 80s now, still living in the same small house in Millbrook where he had grown up. The roof had been properly fixed years ago, paid for by their son's success. His mother made tea and served cookies she had baked that morning. His father sat in his favorite chair, his hands gnarled from decades of factory work. They talked about simple things, neighbors and weather, and local gossip. They did not need to discuss what Thomas had accomplished. They had watched it unfold for 20 years. Before leaving, Thomas walked up to the attic where he had stored the music books Mrs. Crawford had given him as a child. He found the first piece she had ever assigned him, a simple melody by Bach. The pages were yellowed, and worn from years of practice. He thought about all the students who were just beginning their journeys. Somewhere in the world, a child was losing hope because of an injury or disability. Somewhere, a young musician was being told their dreams were impossible. Somewhere, a person was facing darkness and seeing no way forward. Thomas returned to Boston and threw himself back into his work with renewed energy. He expanded the Foundation's programs to reach more people. He trained new teachers to carry on his methods. He worked with researchers to continue improving his techniques. A documentary about his life was released on his 50th birthday. It told the story from the beginning, from the small boy in Millbrook to the revolutionary who changed how music was taught and played. The film won awards at festivals around the world and introduced millions more people to his work. Young pianists who had grown up learning his techniques were now winning international competitions. They played with a freedom and efficiency that amazed judges and audiences. The old debates about traditional versus adaptive technique had largely faded. Both approaches were recognized as valid paths to musical excellence. Medical schools incorporated Thomas's research into their rehabilitation programs. Patients recovering from hand injuries and strokes were shown videos of his performances. If a 9-fingered man could play at Carnegie Hall, perhaps they could learn to tie their shoes again. Hope was itself a form of medicine. Thomas continued performing until his 70th birthday. His final concert was held in the same Boston hall where he had made his comeback decades earlier. The program included pieces he had performed throughout his career, a musical autobiography of sorts. He played with the same passion and precision that had always defined his artistry. His hands moved across the keys with the wisdom of a lifetime's experience. The audience included 3 generations of students he had trained, many now famous in their own right. When he played the final note, Thomas knew it was time to step back from the stage. He had accomplished more than he ever dreamed possible. His techniques were taught in every major conservatory. His foundation served thousands of musicians each year. His legacy was secure, but legacy was never what motivated him. He thought back to the letter from Sarah, the little girl who lost her arm, and wondered if she could still play piano. He thought about Marcus, told by doctors he would never perform again. He thought about the thousands of students who had passed through the Foundation's doors. Each of them represented a life transformed by the simple belief that limitations need not define us. Each was proof that the human spirit could overcome any obstacle. Each was the real purpose of everything Thomas had done. The retirement years were peaceful. Thomas spent his days mentoring the next generation of teachers at the Foundation. He wrote his memoirs, documenting his journey for future readers. He visited schools and hospitals, sharing his story with anyone who needed to hear it. On the 30th anniversary of his accident, Thomas returned to Millbrook for a dedication ceremony. The town had renamed its community center in his honor. A bronze plaque was unveiled with his image and a brief description of his achievements. The townspeople gathered around as Thomas spoke a few words of gratitude. He looked at the familiar streets where he had grown up poor and unknown. He thought about the boy who had first touched a piano in a stranger's living room. That boy could never have imagined where his fingers would take him. Thomas Reed lived to the age of 89. He passed away peacefully, surrounded by family and former students. The music world mourned the loss of a true revolutionary. Tributes poured in from every continent, but his death was not an ending. It was a beginning. The seeds he had planted continued to grow. His techniques evolved in the hands of new generations. His foundation expanded its reach to countries he had never visited. His spirit lived on in every musician who refused to accept impossible as an answer. The story of the nine-fingered pianist became a legend passed down through the years. Teachers told it to students who felt discouraged. Parents read it to children facing challenges. Anyone who felt limited by circumstances found hope in his example. Because Thomas Reed proved something that changed how people understood human potential. He showed that our bodies do not define what we can achieve. He demonstrated that our greatest breakthroughs often come from our greatest breakdowns. He taught the world that 9 fingers, guided by an unbreakable spirit, could make music more beautiful than 10 ever could. The grand piano from Mrs. Crawford's living room still sits in the lobby of the Reed Foundation. Children visit every day to touch its keys and hear its story. And sometimes, when the light falls just right through the windows, visitors swear they can hear the ghost of a melody being played by someone who refused to let a missing finger silence his song.